Not being a person of faith, I didn't have to start my discussion by whatever Arabic sentence you had to start yours with. I'm free to start it with however I want, which is I find liberating. Now, let me first say I want to thank you very much for the kind graciousness with which you invited me, and I'm very hesitant to say some of the things I'm going to say because I learned to be polite to your hosts. But I think it's polite in some sense to try and point out nonsense when nonsense is there, even if it's offensive. So I'm sorry that I'm sure I will offend some people in this audience. I generally offend people in every audience, so you should feel not particularly special. So that's my only defense. What I wanted to do was this announcement for this discussion was presented with a series of questions. After belief in God, prohibitive or liberating, were a series of questions, the first of which is a belief in God rational or irrational? I want to make some comments on that, and I'll make comments on each thing. The first is I decided to look up the organization that invited me, the Muslim Debate Initiative, since you were very rational in your invitation. And I was kind of astounded by how irrational the basis of the organization is, if you'll forgive me. But it said the MDI believes that holds there be no God except one God, the Muhammad, and his final prophet and messenger. MDI also believes that all the preceding prophets named in the Quran, if you believe in them all. Furthermore, the MDI holds that the Quran is a revealed communication from God and thus held to be true and accurate. The examples and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad are universal examples for us to hold on to for all times and places. Lastly, we hold that since humans have not changed in essence or nature since their beginning, the laws of Islam are unchanging and relevant for all timescales. Thus, MDI believes that Islam is intellectually sound and a perfect and complete way of life for mankind. Well, it's hard to know how to work from there because that's obviously nonsense. Humans have not been unchanging in nature and essence. That's the whole basis of evolution. Humans have changed in their characteristics in many, many ways, not just before they became tribal societies, during which their mores, group sizes, xenophobia, all of which has changed. Their cultural evolution has affected humans as much as anything else, but also their biological evolution. Depends where you decide to limit humans. One of the big problems, of course, of religion is that somehow, is at least of the organized religions, is that somehow the first 250,000 years of human evolution is ignored, and all of those poor beings that suffered and died nameless in agony, unfortunately, were not subject to be saved because they didn't exist until the various prophets of the world's major religions. But so to say that something, because humans have not changed in their essence and nature since the beginning, the laws of Islam are unchanging and relevant for all times and places, is just obvious nonsense. And so it's hard to know how one can call that nonsense rational, because rationality is based on, in fact, in general, on the evidence of the world around us. It is people who would go out and say that it's light during the night, we would say are irrational. People who might claim, for example, that Jesus told them to drown their children in a bathtub, we might say are irrational. Unless, of course, that was the basis of a religion. Now, the obvious fact that belief in God is in general irrational is that not all beliefs can be true. As is often stated, everyone of faith is an atheist against all other religions. The only difference between people of faith and atheists is that they're an atheist against one additional religion. And so the point is that since not all religious beliefs can be true because they're mutually inconsistent, the doctrines of each are based on known scientific nonsense if you literally read the scriptures. Clearly, not every religious belief can be rational. It is generally true, from my experience in addressing audiences of people of faith, that that fact is accepted. But what is always accepted is that the other people's faiths are irrational, and people's own faith is rational. There's no objective evidence of that at all. Now, clearly the doctrines of each of the world's major religions, and I'll try, as I say, normally I think because of the context of this, I'll try and refer to Islam a little bit, although I don't think there's anything special about Islam. In fact, there certainly isn't anything special about Islam in the dubiousness of the Scriptures. I think it shares that with all the world's great religions, and also in the immorality inherent in their Scriptures. The immorality that I think most rational people today would look for is inherent in all of those documents, because they were based on societies that, after all, they were based on, in many cases, on the statements of illiterate peasants before we knew that the sun was the center, or almost the center, of our solar system. This great work that was created, and the great cosmology that formed the basis of this Kalam argument, was based before we knew that the Earth orbited the sun and not the other way around. So it's hard to take serious a cosmology based on a universe that people didn't even yet understand, much less the other stars, galaxies, and the Big Bang. But we'll get to that. So the first point is that clearly the creation myths, miracles, the belief in God being rational is kind of ridiculous. And the basis of that is that we look at the world's religions, in particular Islam, which is based on an oral tradition. So we don't even have the written tradition, but we're told that oral tradition, written down ultimately by people up to 300 years after the effect, is the established word of God. Moreover, we're also told that unless you read it in Arabic, you really don't understand it, which suggests, of course, that God is a monoglot. One would hope that God would be able to speak more than one language, but generally one reads the same thing, in fact, for each of the world's religions, whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic for the Old Testament, or Greek or Latin beyond that. If there really is some ultimate truth, it shouldn't depend on a language, certainly if God created a universe with lots of languages. At the same time, the question is it rational to believe that to accept as the undeniable word of God the claims of an illiterate peasant, that they were visited by an angel who told them the truth? I view that in Islam as equally ridiculous as, for example, the claim of Joseph Smith in the Mormon religion that he was also visited by the same angel, by the way, much later, who also revealed the truth to him. Revealed, for example, that Jesus would be visiting Missouri later on, which sounds ridiculous now because it's more recent than those old claims. But the fundamental difference, perhaps, between Muhammad and Joseph Smith is that Joseph Smith was a known con man. Muhammad wasn't. And so, therefore, we could say, in some sense, that claim of the Mormon religion, that Joseph Smith, who, by the way, previously been convicted of claiming to find fake treasure, and of course the basis of the Mormon religion is that he found golden tablets in upstate New York, which he then translated with the help of an angel. He discovered them in the 19th century, translating them unerringly into 17th century English. I mean, accepting that kind of ridiculousness, I don't think most people would claim is rational. The basis of the Scriptures, of course, the Scriptures are full of irrational statements. The virgin birth, the fact that the sun stood still in the Old Testament, these things are clear nonsense. One would have to ask for the rationality of believing that Muhammad ascended to heaven from a place that it wasn't clear he ever visited. But more than that, the claim that you should believe something as to be divine because someone claims it's divine is to give up rationality. Again, because a woman drowns her children in the bathtub because she claims that Jesus told her to, in fact, if you look at the courts nowadays, what they did was clearly she was not rational. She was insane. Now, let me just go back to some of the statements, because I did read some of the work of Dr. Bedard. You're a doctor, I assume. No, it doesn't matter anyway.
Almost.
It doesn't matter. You're almost a doctor. Having a PhD means nothing except you have a PhD, so it doesn't really matter.
That's right.
But the claim that there's other types, I've often been told when I've debated Christian apologists, who are the people I tend to debate more in my country, which is one of the reasons why I decided to come here, because I want to learn from you what arguments you present, is that there's some knowledge other than scientific knowledge that leads to rationality, and they're logic, reports, and conceptual analysis. And the point is that our logic derives from the evidence of reality. Tom, all men are mortal. Tom is a man, therefore Tom is mortal. Well, that's true unless we make people immortal. It's quite possible in this century, in fact, my good friend Freeman Dyson, who I was just debating with on another context last week, was arguing that, in fact, it's quite possible that we'll make people immortal. We'll learn how to stop cell death. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that, but if we do, will they stop being human? No. The evidence of logic derives from the evidence of reality. Is it logical that I can be in two places at once? No, at least by classical logic. But if I'm an electron, I certainly can be, because while you referred to quantum mechanics, I actually understand it. And quantum mechanics is based on the fact that particles are in many places at the same time. And if you deny that, in fact, you come up with the wrong answers. Now, when people can say, well, the interpretation of quantum mechanics is subjective and philosophical, but the point is, the computer you used to present your display was based on quantum mechanics, semiconductors, and in fact, the science works. That's the key point. The science works regardless of your philosophical interpretation. The Big Bang really happened regardless of whether you interpret it to provide evidence for your belief in God or evidence that there's no need for God, that the laws of physics take you back to t equals 0. So logic, of course, derives from empirical reality. It doesn't derive from your brain. If you do, you come up with statements which change over time. The logic, as I say, that an object can't be in two places at once, was subsumed once we realized that particles can be in two places at once. And the key point of science is it's forced you to realize that your logic must derive from the evidence of reality. Rather than imposing your wishes on reality, you have to impose what you believe to be true based on what reality tells you, rather than the other way around. Now, the other thing is reports. So you'd say that people tell you you've been to China. A lot of people, I've debated alien abductees, and I've had a lot of people tell me that they've been up to spacecraft. So should I believe that those spacecraft exist simply because they tell me they believe they've been to them? Absolutely not. Most of us would argue that, and should I believe that woman who heard voices? Well, I can believe she heard voices. Should I believe they're from Jesus? Absolutely not. Without independent verification, outrageous claims require outrageous evidence. And I was amused that you pointed out that I claimed that a belief in a divine being was a grand belief, and then you pointed out with your Kalam argument that in fact there could be nothing grander than someone who created a universe as complex as ours. So I think it's a pretty grand belief and requires important evidence. And then you say the acceptance of the fact that our esteemed moderator had a great-great-great-grandfather is not scientific. Well, of course it is. It's based on empirical evidence. Evidence that each of us has a mother and father. That's empirical evidence. Okay? And so you cannot, if you don't base your logic and your conceptual analysis and your evidence of reports on the basis of empirical evidence, you're not rational. And I think you demonstrated that in the fact that every claim you had for rationality depended upon what we would call the scientific method. We'll have time to talk about the Kalam cosmological argument, but it amazes me by its vacuousness. But it was defined by people in the 11th century who didn't know any better, which is fine. But we now, for example, know how to sum infinite series. Infinities are no problem in mathematics. And moreover, even if you argue, as in fact I would not argue against the fact that the universe had a beginning.